The smell of motor oil and rusted metal hung thick in the air of Peterson's Auto Repair, where Sarah Martinez had spent countless afternoons watching her father work miracles on broken engines. At 19, she possessed hands that moved with surgical precision, and an intuitive understanding of machinery that seemed to flow through her veins like the black coffee her father drank by the gallon. But today felt different. Today, her father's usually steady hands trembled as he stared at the engine that had arrived on the back of a flatbed truck, accompanied by 3 men in expensive suits and predatory smiles. The engine belonged to Marcus Thornfield, the wealthiest man in their small Indiana town and owner of half the businesses on Main Street. For 30 years, he had been systematically buying out local shops, replacing family-owned establishments with corporate chains that funneled profits away from the community that had built them. Sarah's father, Miguel Martinez, had been the last holdout. His auto repair shop, passed down from his own father, represented more than just a business. It was a legacy, a symbol of immigrant success, and the cornerstone of a neighborhood that still believed in honest work and fair prices. Thornfield's offer had been generous. Too generous. The kind of offer that came with unspoken threats when refused. Miguel had declined. Now Thornfield stood in the center of the shop, his polished shoes incongruous against the oil-stained concrete floor, studying the engine that sat before them like a mechanical puzzle designed by a madman. The engine was massive, a prototype from a defunct automotive manufacturer that had reportedly never run properly. Its internals were a labyrinth of custom modifications, experimental components, and engineering decisions that defied conventional wisdom. 3 different shops had already declared it unfixable, including the dealership's master technicians with their computer diagnostics and factory training. Sarah watched from behind a workbench, her hands unconsciously tracing the outline of the wrench in her pocket, as Thornfield circled the engine like a shark sensing blood in the water. "You claim to be the best mechanic in 3 counties. Thornfield's voice carried the casual cruelty of a man accustomed to getting his way. "Prove it." The challenge was simple in its malice. Fix the engine, and Thornfield would not only pay handsomely for the work, but would also leave Miguel's shop alone. Fail, and Miguel would be forced to sell at a fraction of the original offer, his reputation destroyed by the very public failure. Sarah felt her chest tighten as she watched her father's shoulders sag under the weight of an impossible choice. At 55, Miguel Martinez was still one of the finest mechanics she had ever known. But his eyes were failing, his arthritis was worsening, and the precision work required for such an intricate engine would push him beyond his current limits. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of the overhead fluorescent lights and the soft tick of cooling metal. Sarah could see the calculation happening behind her father's eyes, pride warring with pragmatism, love for his craft battling against love for his family. "I'll need 3 days," Miguel finally responded, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was accepting. Thornfield's smile was razor-thin and twice as sharp. 48 hours, and I want witnesses. This is going to be quite the show." As Thornfield and his associates departed, leaving behind only the scent of expensive cologne and the weight of an impossible deadline, Sarah emerged from her hiding spot to find her father standing motionless before the engine. She had never seen him look so small. "Papa," she whispered, the Spanish endearment carrying all the love and concern she couldn't put into words. Miguel turned to her, and for the first time in her life, Sarah saw fear in her father's eyes. Not the healthy caution of a man who worked daily with dangerous machinery, but the deep existential fear of a man watching his life's work crumble before him. "Mija, this engine, it's not just broken. It's been sabotaged, modified specifically to be unfixable. The compression ratios don't match, the timing is completely off, and half these components aren't even compatible with each other." Sarah moved closer, her trained eye already cataloging the engine's problems. The fuel injection system had been retrofitted with parts from at least 3 different manufacturers. The valve train showed signs of deliberate misalignment. Someone had spent considerable time and money ensuring this engine would never run. Why would someone do this? Miguel's laugh was bitter and tired, because they knew eventually it would end up here. They knew I couldn't resist the challenge, and they knew it would destroy me when I failed. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow bed above the shop, listening to the sounds of her father working below. The rhythmic tap of hammer on metal, the whir of power tools, the frustrated sighs that grew more frequent as the hours passed. Each sound was a nail in the coffin of everything her family had built. By dawn, Miguel had managed to correct some of the engine's more obvious problems. But the fundamental issues remained. The engine was a mechanical contradiction, a puzzle designed not to be solved, but to break the spirit of whoever attempted it. Word had spread through the town with the efficiency that only small communities can achieve. By noon, a crowd had gathered outside Peterson's Auto Repair, not just customers and neighbors, but representatives from the local newspaper, business owners who had already sold to Thornfield, and curious onlookers drawn by the spectacle of a local institution's potential downfall. Sarah watched from the shop's small office window as Thornfield arrived in his black Mercedes, flanked by the same associates who had delivered the engine. Their confidence was palpable, the satisfaction of a game already won evident in their casual postures and barely concealed smirks. Inside the shop, Miguel worked with the desperate intensity of a man running out of time. His hands, usually so steady and sure, fumbled with tools he had used for decades. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air, and Sarah could see the tremor in his fingers growing more pronounced with each passing hour. The crowd outside grew larger and more restless. Some had come to support Miguel, bringing coffee and encouragement. Others seemed drawn by the morbid fascination of watching a man's dreams die in public. The atmosphere felt charged with anticipation and dread, like the moment before a summer storm breaks. Sarah could no longer stand to watch her father struggle alone. She descended from the office, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space of the shop floor. "Heath, Papa. Let me help." Miguel looked up from the engine, his face etched with exhaustion and defeat. "Mija, this isn't your burden. This is my shop, my responsibility." "This is our family," Sarah replied, moving to stand beside him at the workbench. "Our legacy. Let me help you save it." What happened next would be talked about in their small town for years to come. Sarah approached the engine not with her father's systematic methodology, but with the intuitive understanding that came from a lifetime of watching, learning, and absorbing mechanical knowledge through pure osmosis. Where Miguel saw individual problems to be solved sequentially, Sarah saw the engine as a living system, a complex organism whose various ailments were interconnected. Her hands moved across the engine with a confidence that seemed to surprise even her. She traced fuel lines with her fingers, feeling for pressure inconsistencies. She listened to the subtle sounds of metal under stress, her ear trained by years of diagnosing problems by sound alone. "The injection timing is wrong because they've paired it with a throttle body from a completely different engine family," she murmured, more to herself than to her father. "But if we bypass the primary sensor and use the secondary feedback loop..." Miguel watched in amazement as his daughter began to disassemble sections of the engine he hadn't even considered touching. Her approach was unconventional, almost artistic in its deviation from standard repair protocols. But there was undeniable logic in her methodology. Outside, the crowd had grown restless. Thornfield checked his expensive watch with theatrical frequency, his associates sharing knowing glances that suggested the outcome was already decided. The local newspaper photographer positioned himself for the best angle to capture Miguel's moment of defeat. But inside the shop, something extraordinary was happening. Terry had identified the engine's central contradiction. It had been designed with components that created a mechanical feedback loop, where fixing one problem would inevitably create another. The solution wasn't to repair each issue individually, but to reframe the entire engine's operation, essentially turning its built-in failures into functional features. "Papa, hand me that intake manifold from the '97 Camaro." "Mija, that won't fit this engine. Trust me." For the next 6 hours, Sarah worked with a focus and intensity that seemed to bend reality around her. She cannibalized parts from other engines in the shop, creating custom solutions that existed nowhere in any repair manual. She rewired electrical systems, machined new gaskets by hand, and somehow convinced incompatible components to work in harmony. Miguel found himself serving as her assistant, following her lead with a mixture of pride and bewilderment. His daughter was performing mechanical surgery with the confidence of a master craftsman, yet improvising solutions that challenged everything he thought he knew about engine repair. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the shop's grimy windows, Sarah made her final adjustments to the engine. The crowd outside had swelled to nearly 100 people, their conversations creating a constant buzz of anticipation that seemed to vibrate through the building's walls. Thornfield himself had grown visibly agitated as the day progressed. What should have been a simple execution of a planned defeat had stretched far longer than anticipated, and the growing crowd meant more witnesses to whatever conclusion was about to unfold. Sarah stepped back from the engine, her clothes stained with oil and coolant, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail that had long since come undone. She looked exhausted, but determined. like a soldier who had fought a brutal battle and wasn't certain of the outcome. "Papa, it's ready." Miguel approached the engine with hands that no longer trembled. Whatever the outcome, his daughter had given everything she had to save their family's legacy. That alone was worth more than any business deal or community reputation. He turned the key. The engine didn't just start. It roared to life with a power and smoothness that seemed impossible given its Frankenstein construction. The sound was magnificent. A deep, throaty rumble that spoke of perfectly balanced internals and optimal combustion efficiency. The crowd outside fell silent, then erupted in cheers that could be heard 3 blocks away. But Sarah wasn't finished. As the engine settled into a perfect idle, she walked to the front of the shop and opened the large bay doors, allowing the crowd to see and hear the impossible engine running flawlessly. Then she did something no one expected. She began to explain exactly what she had discovered. "This engine wasn't just broken," she announced, her voice carrying clearly over the rumbling motor. "It was deliberately sabotaged. Someone spent considerable time and money making sure it could never be repaired using conventional methods." The crowd pressed closer, sensing that something more significant than a simple repair was being revealed. Sarah walked to a workbench and picked up a handful of components she had removed from the engine, parts that had been specifically designed to create failure points. She held them up for the crowd to see. "These aren't standard automotive parts. They're custom manufactured pieces designed to look like they belong, but engineered to fail. Someone wanted this engine to be unfixable." A murmur rippled through the crowd as the implications of her words began to sink in. The question isn't whether this engine could be repaired. The question is why someone would go to such elaborate lengths to ensure it couldn't be. All eyes turned to Thornfield, whose confident demeanor had evaporated like morning dew under Sarah's unflinching gaze. His associates had taken subtle steps backward, distancing themselves from whatever revelation was about to unfold. Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small metal component, a custom-machined piece that she had removed from the engine's fuel system. "This part has a serial number. It was manufactured by Thornfield Industries machine shop 3 months ago." The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd turned to look at Thornfield, who stood frozen like a deer in headlights, his carefully constructed trap having backfired spectacularly. The local newspaper photographer, sensing a much bigger story than he had anticipated, began snapping pictures with renewed vigor. "You see," Sarah continued, her voice steady and clear, "this was never about testing my father's skills as a mechanic. This was about manufacturing a public failure that would justify forcing him to sell. This was about destroying a man's reputation, to clear the way for another corporate takeover." The crowd's murmur grew louder, anger beginning to replace curiosity. These were people who had watched Thornfield systematically dismantle their community's economic independence, and they were finally seeing the calculated cruelty behind his business methods. Sarah wasn't finished. "My father has been repairing engines in this town for 30 years. He's kept your cars running, your business is moving, your family's safe on the road. He's never overcharged, never done unnecessary work, never put profit above people." She paused, letting her words sink in. "That's not just good business. That's character. That's the kind of integrity that builds communities instead of destroying them." The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah raised her hand for silence. "This engine will run perfectly now. Not because we were lucky, not because we compromised our principles, but because when you fight for something that matters, when you refuse to accept defeat, when you remember that your work is about more than just making money, that's when impossible becomes possible." As if summoned by her words, Miguel stepped forward to stand beside his daughter. Father and daughter faced the crowd together, oil-stained and exhausted but unbroken. The local newspaper ran the story on the front page the next morning. "Local mechanic's daughter exposes corporate sabotage, saves family business." But the real story spread through social media, where video footage of Sarah's revelation went viral within hours. The state attorney general's office opened an investigation into Thornfield's business practices. Other shop owners who had been pressured to sell came forward with their own stories of suspicious, unfixable problems that had appeared just before Thornfield made his offers. Within 6 months, Thornfield Industries faced federal charges for commercial sabotage and racketeering. The man, who had terrorized local businesses for decades, found himself fighting for his own financial survival. But perhaps the most significant change was in Sarah herself. She enrolled in mechanical engineering at the state university, but continued working at her father's shop on weekends. The engine that was supposed to destroy their family had instead revealed her extraordinary gift for understanding complex mechanical systems. Major automotive manufacturers began reaching out, interested in the young woman who had solved an impossible engineering problem using nothing but intuition, determination, and spare parts. Job offers arrived from across the country, each more lucrative than the last. Sarah turned them all down. Why? Miguel asked one evening as they worked side by side on a customer's transmission. Sarah looked around the shop that had shaped her entire life. The oil-stained workbenches, the wall of hand tools worn smooth by decades of use, the faded photographs of customers and their restored vehicles. Because this is where I belong, Papa. This is where the work matters. 3 years later, Martinez Auto Repair had expanded into the building next door. Sarah had developed innovative repair techniques that attracted customers from hundreds of miles away, but she never forgot the lesson learned that day when an impossible engine nearly destroyed her family. The work itself was sacred, the relationships with customers were sacred, the commitment to honest service was sacred. Everything else was just business. On quiet evenings, when the last customer had left and the shop fell silent except for the tick of cooling engines, Sarah would sometimes run her hand along the workbench where she had performed her mechanical miracle. The wood was scarred and stained from decades of use, marked by the honest labor of 2 generations of Martinez mechanics. Those scars told a story of persistence, of refusing to surrender in the face of impossible odds, of finding solutions where others saw only problems. They were the marks of people who understood that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought for money or recognition, but for the simple right to do good work in service of your community. The impossible engine had been fixed not through superior technology or expensive tools, but through the application of wisdom, creativity, and an unshakable belief that integrity always finds a way. In a world increasingly dominated by corporate interests and disposable relationships, Martinez Auto Repair stood as proof that some things, craftsmanship, family legacy, community trust, are worth fighting for. And sometimes, when you fight for what matters most, the impossible becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The engine still runs perfectly to this day,